guys want a handout? Oh, yeah. Some people might want their handout.
Okay, we'll proceed first with Department of Education.
Good morning. Monique Ramos on behalf of the Department of Education. So we wanted to briefly just go over essentially what happened with the $26 million that was provided.
Okay. Actually, I apologize. We wanted to start with the LAO to provide an overview of this issue.
Good morning. Natasha Collins, Legislative Analyst Office. The Sergeant is distributing one of our handouts that I'll be speaking from to provide some background on the emphasis on internet infrastructure at schools, some background on how schools connect to the internet, and some information on the Broadband Infrastructure Improvement Grant. And the CDE will follow up with an update on that grant, as well as findings from a recent report pertaining to internet in schools. So page 1 provides some background on the more recent emphasis on internet, which is really stemming from the need for California students to take an online assessment known as the Smarter Balanced Assessment, or SBAC. The SBAC requires all students to take the test, the online version of the test, by spring 2018, and in the interim, they may take a paper and pencil test. In spring 2014, California administered a trial test. And while most schools successfully administered the online version of the test, some schools were unable to administer it on site or had difficulty administering it online at their school site. Schools are currently administering this test right now, as you may have been hearing in the news. As described on page 2, in 2014-15, the state created a grant program for certain schools to improve their online testing capabilities, known as the Broadband Infrastructure Improvement Grant, or BIG. The state provided $27 million for the BIG grants, and it was designed to pay for a portion of the school's internet connections. This portion is known as the last mile connection. As you can see in the figure at the bottom of page 2, this is essentially how most schools connect to the internet. First, they have a last mile connection, which is the portion of the internet that BIG could pay for, which typically goes to a district office, but could also go to a county office of education. From that point, the high-speed network, which you'll hear from later, pays for the connection from all 58 of the county offices of education to a education backbone, which is operated by a nonprofit organization called CNIC. And then from there, CNIC connects to the internet writ large. As described on page 3, last year's BIG eligibility, schools that could apply for a BIG grant for that last mile connection I described, were limited to 2 types of schools. Either schools that were unable to administer the online SBAC test, or to schools that had difficulty administering the test, such that they had to stop other essential online activities such as administration or email in order to administer the test online at their school site. The high-speed network was tasked with identifying eligible schools and finding infrastructure providers for those schools. The HSN identified 304 schools at that time that were eligible for BIG and secured contracts with commercial infrastructure providers for 227 of those schools. As this was at an estimated cost at the time of $22 million of that approximately $27 million that was allocated towards this purpose in the current year. The high-speed network and CNIC were unable to find commercial infrastructure providers for 64 of the eligible schools as of the January budget. And you'll see on page 4 a map of where these 64 schools are located around the state by their eligibility type. So the darker dots are the schools that were unable to administer the tests, and the lighter dots are those that had difficulty administering the tests. Since the governor's January budget proposal, there has been some progress in providing better connections to these schools. And I believe the CDE is going to provide an update on those schools as well as a recent report at this point. And I'll be speaking from this handout later with our assessment and recommendations of the governor's budget once that's presented. Thank you.
Next.
Monique Ramos from the Department of Education. So as of April 15 of this year, we have a total of 171 sites that essentially have received services. This includes 18 sites who, as of January, did not have bids. We've been able to move forward with providers and find solutions for those schools. So at this point, of the approximately 131 schools have received 1 gigabyte connections, and the remainder of the schools have received at least 100 megabytes of the connection. All of this, the 1 gigabyte is a national recommendation, but the 100 megabytes is enough to actually connect to the assessment system and utilize the Smarter Balance assessment system. The 47 school sites that remain are some of the most difficult to connect. Often it's because of geographical barriers or just businesses not having an interest to connect to those areas. We are working on trying to find solution for those districts. It often includes temporary solutions such as satellite or microwave connections. Those have a lifespan of usually 5 to 7 years, so we would view it as a temporary solution. And finally, as of March of this year, the department and K-12 HSN had a meeting with several service providers in order to determine how to try to get to some of those last sites and really connect those schools. At this point, I think K-12 HSN is going to provide an overview of the report.
Good morning, everyone. Luis Wong from the K-12 High Speed Network. I wanted to provide a quick overview of some work that we were tasked to do this year. Two things. One was the broadband infrastructure grants, as Monique provided a brief overview. And then the second piece of the work was developing a statewide report to assess where schools are at in terms of their infrastructure to be able to move forward with the computer adaptive system. So I will basically focus on the key observations of the report. The report was released in 2 installments. The first installment was delivered on February 27th of 2015, and then the supplemental report that came after that was released on April 17th. The first report actually focused on the process of the grant. It really focused on how we identified the 304 schools. It really talked about the process that we went through to secure the bids and to secure all the arrangements to try to get these 170 schools moving forward with improved broadband infrastructure. The second piece in the supplemental report focused on an assessment of 500 schools in California that were randomly selected, which we received a response rate of 88% of schools with information coming back of how does their infrastructure look like in order to support the assessments and learning through broadband infrastructure. We focused on 5 key observations. The first observation that we found is that the quality of technical support of network infrastructure varies among districts and county offices and could be improved. One significant piece that we found is that technical expertise at the actual school sites to be able to support broadband infrastructure is very limited. And even at the more focused on the local site. Local sites really don't have adequate staffing to support the teachers and the assessment coordinators when they're going through the testing process. The second observation is California K-12 public schools lack access to last and middle mile infrastructure. The infrastructure, these are the roads that get these schools connected. While we were very successful in getting some of the schools connected, it's very clear from this process that there's still schools that are in communities that are very isolated in terms of broadband infrastructure. They don't really have the highways or the freeways that get them connected. So when we call the middle mile, those are the freeways that get to those communities. And so without those freeways, we can't build those roads to connect these schools in the digital world. So definitely there's a lot more work to be done. While we think that the broadband infrastructure grant process was successful, we didn't really capture the whole universe of schools that have challenges in terms of broadband and internet connectivity. We expect that through this round to this current assessment cycle, because we went into production with assessments, more schools will surface with these types of issues. The third observation is some school sites in California cannot fully utilize their improved internet connection because their internal infrastructure is inadequate. So the connectivity within the school, when we talk about the wires to the classrooms, when we talk about enough computers, when we talk about wireless access points, is really not sufficient. One of the things that we found is that close to 20% of the schools have inadequate local infrastructure inside the school. And again, this correlates really directly to the fact that schools have limited technical expertise at the sites. So this is also a consequence that follows that piece. The fourth observation talks about having an expanded conversation about broadband capacity at schools to meet 21st century learning. So really expand from having broadband connectivity just for the assessments. There's a lot of work at the national level and emphasis on trying to get schools into the digital age and making sure that they have adequate infrastructure for teaching and learning, and making sure that our students and our teachers have the resources that they need to be competitive in this new economic world. So really aligning that conversation about how do we get our schools into the gigabit era where they have enough resources there to do what they need to do. And then the fifth observation focuses on data collection and connectivity in K-12 schools, which is inconsistent and really impacting the planning efforts of schools and county offices. Part of this report helps shine a light on that issue, but it speaks to, that we have to do these kinds of one-time efforts to really understand what the issues are around connectivity. And we do basically look at recommending that we look at ways of collecting better information in terms of how schools are connected and how their technology infrastructure looks like, so that we can provide better information and make better decisions in terms of how we make these investments. Thank you.
Amber Alexander with the Department of Finance. I'll be providing an overview of the governor's budget proposal on this particular topic. The governor's budget provides $100 million in one-time Proposition 98 funds for school districts to enhance their internet connectivity. This builds upon the $26.7 million that was provided in the 2014 budget for this same purpose. In addition, the governor's budget allocates an additional $8.8 million from the K-12 high-speed networks reserve account for additional grants, which will provide a total of approximately $109 million for schools to use to address their internet connectivity issues. Priority for the grants will continue to be first for sites that are unable to administer computer-based assessments on-site, and second for sites that are only able to do so by shutting down all other essential online activities. These priorities recognize that California is currently in the process of transitioning to a new assessment system that places a high emphasis on computer-based assessments, and exams that were previously paper-pencil administrations will now be computer-based. As more computer-based assessments come online, we anticipate that there will be a greater demand on state and district network capacity. And as we'll hear in the next item, the state has already taken steps to invest broadly in the accountability system. And in order to reap the full benefits of those investments, it's important to be able to administer these tests efficiently. The governor's proposal signals a continued commitment to improving infrastructure at school sites, as well as bringing internet to places that are currently unserved and underserved. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you. Questions from committee members, comments? Elio, did you want to respond again?
Yeah, thank you. Natasha Collins with the Legislative Analyst's Office. Referring back to the handout that we provided, I think the Department of Finance provided a great overview of the governor's proposal. So I'm going to move to page 6, which provides our assessment of that proposal. So with regard to how to connect schools that currently have difficulty or are unable to administer the SBAC tests, you have several options. They range from very expensive to potentially very expensive to very inexpensive. The first option you have would be to build last-mile connections using fiber optic cables to the remaining schools. But this could cost millions of dollars and would serve very few students, less than 2,000 in fact. This option would be expensive because it requires the installation of cables across large swaths of land, and things like trenching, getting around certain protected areas throughout the state could be very costly. There's a reason that this infrastructure doesn't currently exist. It's because there's not a market in that area for this infrastructure. However, the fiber optic cable solution would provide the fastest internet, and it would provide a scalable solution, meaning that it could be scaled up over time to provide faster and faster internet connections. Just to give you an example of the kind of cost this could incur, although this was not accepted as a bid by the CDE or HSN, there was one school that had 5 test-taking students, and a bid that was received was for $10 million, so that would be $2 million per student. They did not accept that bid, but that just gives you a sense of some of the costs that we could be dealing with if we take this option. The second option would be to connect the remaining schools using airborne solutions, which was mentioned earlier, the satellite or microwave options. These are less expensive than the fiber optic solution because it doesn't require the same types of installation. However, speeds would not be as fast, and these solutions are not scalable, meaning we can't invest. It would be difficult. Probably impossible. I can't predict the future. Maybe the satellites will get better in the future, but as of now, we can't scale up how fast they're going to be over time. However, I would note that the HSN indicates that within the first allocation of the big grant at $27 million, the remaining identified school sites from last year's round or from the current year round of big could be addressed using satellite and microwave solutions within the existing allocation. The last solution you would have would be the least expensive, which would be to ask schools to test a small number of students at a time, so there would reduce congestion on their existing infrastructure, bus students to other locations such as county offices of education, or require schools to administer the paper and pencil test until for the next 2 years. So those are your 3 options. Turning to the HSN budget reserve issue, like the governor, we have concerns about this large budget reserve, which last year was over 100% of their annual expenditures. And just to give you an idea of a comparable school district that has the same types of expenditures as the HSN, they, as a median, carry about a 20% budget reserve. So this is a large reserve. To ensure sufficient oversight, state law currently requires an audit of the HSN annually. However, currently this audit is embedded in a larger audit of the administering agency, which is the Imperial County Office of Education. And currently there is no financial information specific to HSN within this general audit. Page 6 describes our recommendations on how to move forward with providing infrastructure to schools as well as the HSN budget reserve. First, we recommend that the legislature not fund extraordinary costs for the big schools. We recommend using a low-cost option that would be available and still allow students to take the tests online at their school site. To ensure that per student costs are reasonable, we recommend the legislature set a maximum per pupil amount for serving the remaining schools that are eligible for the big grants. We also recommend that the legislature reject the governor's proposal to spend an additional $8.8 million from the HSN reserve on the big grants because we don't believe these additional funds are needed for big. Instead, we recommend that the HSN use 8.3 of the budget reserve for their operating costs in 15-16, and this would free up 8.3 in Proposition 98 for other purposes in that year. Lastly, to determine an appropriate reserve and funding level, we recommend that the audit of HSN be strengthened through language to require it be separate from the overall Imperial County Office of Education audit. Okay, thank you very much.
Ms. Kim?
Just for, I was talking to my consultant here just for clarification, but I think I can address this or ask you. Last week we heard about the internet connectivity issue in our committee. So just trying to understand, is there any coordination with the outlier schools in the near libraries? So if funding is provided to help connect the libraries, can the schools use nearby local libraries for testing purposes also? What kind of coordination efforts?
So I'm going to speak to one point about using libraries to coordinate, and then I'm going to let Luis discuss the kind of coordination that's occurring. So busing students to different facilities is a short-term solution, I think, what the department would view, because this means that students can't then access the tools that they can utilize all year long. So all we're doing then is purchasing. We've spent a ton of money in this system, and all we're doing is utilizing it for the summative assessment. So we view that as a short-term option. There are also some requirements surrounding the assessment system that that libraries may or may not have. So I'm not sure that a library would necessarily be the best place to take the assessment. If that was a route the legislature wanted to go, we would probably be better off going to a county office of education or another LEA, given that they are also utilizing those systems.
The libraries are joining the education infrastructure this year. There's been some funds put in place. The libraries are barely starting to catch up in terms of their broadband infrastructure. Not only that, they operate under a different environment. They don't use any filtering systems or anything that prevents students from getting into inappropriate sites. So there are definitely some challenges there. In terms of also busing students in some of these remote areas, the distances are quite large. So it would take a long time to move students in these areas.
Okay, thank you. We're going to hold this item open as well for the May readers. Oh, do we have public comment on this issue?
Good morning. I'm Kim Lewis, representing the Corporation for Education Network Initiatives in California, or CNIC, as referenced in your agenda. Just wanted to speak in that we've been working very hard and diligently with K-12 HSN and CDE and ensuring that we're able to connect those sites and looking for alternative solutions for the sites that are still without bids. We use the federal E-rate process to ensure that we're able to access federal funds and draw that down so that the ongoing costs for school districts remain affordable for them. I would just highlight that we run the largest E-rate consortium in the nation. Also, we are supportive of the governor's proposal for an additional $100 million to help solve this connectivity problem for schools, and would just comment on what Luis said around libraries. Yes, so we are in phase 1 of bringing on libraries to CNIC, and this is going to be probably about a 2 to 3 year project and bringing the rest of the sites on board. Thank you.
Good morning. Barrett Snyder, on behalf of the California Educational Technology Professionals Association, representing the chief technology officers in the state. Supportive of the governor's proposal and the $100 million to round out some of the infrastructure issues. Also want to raise sort of a growing problem in schools that you should be aware of, which is a lot of the financing for a lot of the technology-related elements that are in schools are moving to a subscription-based model, not unlike a Spotify subscription you might have or something like that, to the tune of, by a lot of estimates, about $100 a kid. Is kind of rounding out. That's everything from the information systems to anything you really, even some of the hardware contracts are going that way. That really speaks to the need schools have for sort of an ongoing pot of money to make sure these needs are met, because it's sort of infrastructure. We think about it in testing, but it's everything from testing to payroll to instruction in the classroom. And so we would encourage the committee and the legislature to really consider what are we doing long term for the huge costs of technology infrastructure in the state. Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblymember Ting?
So I had a quick follow-up question to LAO. You had mentioned potentially going with the satellite options. I think that the busing or moving the kids to a remote site or even limiting the internet access doesn't solve the issue of broadband access. Since we're moving more toward digital education, we need to make sure that we are upgrading that infrastructure across the state. Just wanted to understand what the costs were if we moved to a satellite and why it wasn't scalable.
So the satellite connections are very limited in bandwidth, and they also are very slow in terms of what we call latency. So they're really not conducive for certain applications on the network. The costs for satellite are not that high, but again, these are very limited. They can't scale. They're very expensive in terms of...
When you say they can't scale, what do you mean? Because it seems like you can put a satellite dish on every single building. So
right, but they will provide very low bandwidth. So we're talking less than 20 megabits, and for a school with many kids and all their administrative needs of using the connection, it's very low.
But at 20 megabits, which is generally what individuals like us would use for, say, DSL at home, couldn't you have, I mean, you're talking, $2 million a kid. $2 million could buy a lot of satellite dishes, couldn't they?
Sure. But that, you see...
Am I incorrect? I guess, so you're saying can't scale. I'm not quite... You keep saying that terminology, and it doesn't seem to be accurate, I guess, because is there a reason I can't put multiple satellite dishes onto a school? Is there something that is forbidden in code, or what is stopping me? Because it strikes me as if you look at most of the developing world, they are not laying down fiber optics or cable. They've skipped it. I think if you look at most of Asia, they probably have faster broadband access than we do. They're primarily dependent on their mobile system, and all of it is over the air. None of it is wirelines. I'm just trying to understand this.
What they don't say is that you need the fiber infrastructure, the wired infrastructure, to get to those towers to then distribute. The towers are just used for distribution points, but then to move all that traffic that's coming from these wireless antennas, they backhaul these through wired connections, such as fiber optic.
Mm-hmm.
So
you're saying that because these schools are in such remote locations, there's not even a station that they can get to.
Absolutely, that's the issue. And you'll see that these, not only the schools are isolated, but the libraries and the entire communities have very, very poor connectivity.
So the proposal is what? Are you, because it sounds like it's more than just laying down fiber optic cable, or is that really what it is?
Right. Well, it's about trying to get to these communities and trying to work with other...
I understand what it's trying to do. Right. Can you give me the technical terminology? I mean, I understand the verbiage.
The budget bill language specifies that the $100 million is available for network connectivity infrastructure grants, so it doesn't prescribe a particular method. It doesn't specify.
What have other schools in the past used it for?
This first round, they focused mostly on last mile, and I believe most of the connections that were implemented ended up being fiber optic.
Again, we're using a lot of terminology. When you say last mile, are you laying a cable the last mile? Are we, using a satellite dish? I mean, what are we driving a bus the last mile? I mean, help me understand. What are we doing the last mile here?
Last mile is fiber to the schools, putting fiber optic cable.
Fiber optic cable to the school that gets laid from. So
by service providers such as AT&T.
Is it really a mile? Or is it because if it's only a mile, then couldn't you use a satellite?
That's the term, but it's not a mile. That's what they call the last connection from the school to the school district. That's what they call the last mile, but it's not technically a mile. In some cases, in Death Valley, it's over 100 miles.
I guess what's missing for me is, I know we identified the districts, and I'm obviously very empathetic, and I think they should have broadband connection like the rest of us. Having said that, I know that many schools, even say in my district, struggle from having broadband connection, even though we're in the heart of Silicon Valley. So I'm just also just trying to understand the costs, and what's missing here is, we've identified the number of schools, but what's missing is what their potential budgets are, so we can really understand, is this a appropriate use of spending? When you talk about last mile, sort of creates a smokescreen of sorts as to what the actual costs are and what we're really, really doing. I think the LAO put it really well, where you talk about this money, but if you're only spending $10 million on five kids, and I'm totally sympathetic. It just seems like that's a lot of money just for a internet connection when we could be frankly doing much more for those 5 kids.
Right. And again, this was a very unique circumstance because there is the freeways aren't there to get to that school. And absolutely. And we're not saying that fiber is the only way. I mean, for these sites, we do need to go through that engineering process to really determine what those costs are going to be, whether it's terrestrial type of wireless infrastructure or satellite connectivity.
But now you're contradicting yourself. You just came through talking about the last mile and talking about how a cable was the way. We couldn't use other yes.
So I think one of the things that's what we're doing right now, right? We're having those conversations with service providers, and we're having the conversation with schools about how to connect those really difficult school sites. We don't necessarily have the answer at this moment for you, and it's partially just timing in the process. Satellite and microwave are a solution. They are, I think, the problem with the satellite and the microwave is that you have to replace the equipment more frequently. So a consideration to take into those impacts is that, that equipment would need to be replaced in 5 to 7 years, and it's pricey equipment for an LEA essentially.
It is, but fiber optic cable could be obsolete in 5 to 10 years.
That's true as well.
So it's not. I mean, I don't. Well.
It has a much higher service life.
Assemblymember Ting, I would just say that part of our recommendation is that we set a maximum per pupil amount. So because we don't know the cost, so the spending doesn't get out of control. So if we were to set a certain amount, if you have this many test-taking students, this is how much we could spend per student, not $2 million, but maybe something more along the lines in the few hundreds, then that would determine if we use a satellite solution or a fiber optic solution. Yeah. Because we really don't know what the costs are at this point. And right now, $109 million is... it's not really tied to any actual cost.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think in converse, if the schools came back with specific plans or more detailed plans versus we're still looking at it, then I think that we could really evaluate and give them a higher amount. But right now, like I said, if you've been to Asia. When I went to Asia in the late 1980s, I thought they would never catch up because they didn't have the wire-based infrastructure that we do. Somehow they've skipped not only that generation, but really us in terms of their speed and their broadband speed and, frankly, their broadband access. And I think it's something that we should take as a lesson, that we shouldn't be held so much to what we know and not be afraid of what we don't know yet. So, especially when you don't have a plan, you're like, well, the schools are coming forward and they don't have a plan. We don't know what they're going to do. So we're supposed to give money for something. So I think that's a challenge. I think absolutely the LAO's example is right on. We should absolutely limit the amount of money that we're spending because we have a number of other budgetary needs.
Okay, thank you. Again, we're going to hold this issue open until the May revision. Proceed now to issue number 4.